You don't wake an A-10, unless it wants to wake for you. The words were low, almost swallowed by the dry Texas wind sweeping across the tarmac, but they hung there, heavy, as if the aircraft itself had heard them. 12 minutes. That was all they had. The clock on the operations truck ticked down in harsh red digits, each second louder than the last, each second tightening the air around the grounded A-10 like a noose. The aircraft sat motionless under the afternoon sun, its dull gray skin radiating heat, its twin engines silent in a way that felt wrong, like a heartbeat that had simply chosen to stop. Around it, a cluster of technicians moved with forced urgency, laptops open, cables trailing across the concrete, diagnostic screens glowing green with false confidence. Everything read normal. Everything said the machine should fly. And yet it didn't. Captain Ryan Cole stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, jaw tight, the kind of posture that tried to hold authority together when it was already slipping. His eyes flicked from the countdown clock to the aircraft, then to the old man standing just beyond the perimeter line. Earl Donovan didn't look like he belonged anywhere near a combat aircraft. His jacket was faded, the kind of olive green that had long since lost its original color, and his hands rested loosely at his sides, stained with oil that no amount of washing had ever fully removed. He wasn't watching the crew. He wasn't watching the clock. He was watching the A-10. Not the whole aircraft, just a section near the left intake, as if the rest of it didn't matter. Cole let out a sharp breath, half frustration, half something else he didn't want to name, then reached down and grabbed a set of keys from a nearby tool cart. The metal clinked in his hand as he stepped toward Donovan, boots striking the concrete with deliberate force. "Hey," he called out, loud enough for the crew to hear, loud enough to turn this into a moment. "You've been staring at it long enough." A few technicians glanced over, smirks already forming, the tension breaking just enough for arrogance to slip back in. Cole stopped a few feet from the old man and tossed the keys underhand. Donovan caught them without looking, the motion smooth, automatic. "Go ahead," Cole said, a thin smile cutting across his face. "Start it. Let's see what all that experience gets you." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the group, subtle but sharp. Someone muttered something about museum pieces. Another shook his head, eyes already dismissing the scene before it even played out. Donovan didn't respond. He didn't look at Cole, didn't acknowledge the laughter, didn't even glance at the keys now resting in his palm. Instead, he took a single step forward, crossing the invisible line that separated observer from operator, and placed his hand gently against the aircraft's skin. The metal was hot, almost too hot to touch, but he didn't pull away. His fingers spread slightly, as if feeling for something beneath the surface, something no diagnostic tool could measure. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of jet fuel and sun-baked concrete, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade, the voices, the ticking clock, even the weight of the mission pressing down on all of them. There was only the machine, and the man standing beside it, listening. The clock dropped to 10 minutes and the tension sharpened with it, cutting through the heat like a blade no one could see but everyone could feel, and still the aircraft refused to respond, its silence growing heavier by the second as if it were choosing to ignore them all. Captain Cole exhaled through his nose, watching Donovan with a mix of impatience and something closer to irritation now, because the old man had not moved with urgency, had not even acknowledged the pressure, and that alone felt like defiance. "You planning to actually do something?" Cole called out, louder this time, his voice carrying across the tarmac, drawing more eyes, more attention, because if this was going to fail, he wanted witnesses. A few of the technicians shifted their weight, folding their arms, already settling into the expectation that nothing would happen, that this would end exactly as it should, with the old man stepping back and the machine staying dead. But Donovan did not step back. Instead he leaned slightly closer to the intake, his head tilting just enough that his ear aligned with the curve of the metal, and for a brief moment it looked less like inspection and more like listening, as if the aircraft were saying something too quiet for anyone else to hear. A faint tick sounded from somewhere deep inside the engine housing, so soft it barely existed, lost beneath the whisper of the wind and the distant hum of base activity, but Donovan's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against the surface, marking the sound like a point on a map. Behind him, Airman First Class Lucas Reed frowned, lowering the tablet in his hands. Because he had been staring at clean data for the last 20 minutes and none of it matched the way the old man was acting, none of it explained why someone would ignore a full diagnostic system and trust a sound no one else could even confirm. Everything is green, one of the technicians said, half to Cole, half to himself, as if repeating it would make it more true. There is nothing wrong with that subsystem, and yet the words did not land the way they were supposed to, not with Donovan still standing there, not with the clock now reading 8 minutes. Donovan finally moved, but not toward the cockpit, not toward the obvious controls. Instead he stepped along the fuselage in a slow, deliberate path, each step measured, his gaze never leaving the aircraft, tracing lines no one else seemed to notice, until he stopped at a small panel just beneath the engine cowling, a panel so ordinary it had been ignored by everyone else. He ran his fingers along its edge, not opening it, not forcing anything, just feeling. And then he pressed lightly against one corner, holding it there as if waiting for something to answer. The wind shifted again, carrying a low, almost reluctant metallic click from inside the housing, a sound so subtle it could have been dismissed as expansion from the heat, but Donovan did not dismiss it. He nodded once, almost to himself, and for the first time his voice came, quiet, steady, cutting through the noise without needing volume. "She is not dead," he said, his tone certain in a way that made the words land heavier than any shouted command. "She is just waiting," and behind him, the laughter that had been building never quite formed, because something in the way he said it made even the most confident among them hesitate, just for a second, just long enough for doubt to slip in where certainty had been. The air changed after he said it, not in a way anyone could measure, not in a way any instrument could capture, but it shifted all the same, like a pressure drop before a storm, and the technicians felt it even if they could not explain it, because certainty had been their shield and now it had a crack in it. Captain Cole let out a short laugh that came a fraction too late, a fraction too forced. "Waiting," he repeated, shaking his head as if the word itself was ridiculous, as if reducing it to something simple could restore control. "It is a machine, not a person," but the sentence did not land the way he intended, not with Donovan still standing there, not with the clock now reading 6 minutes and falling. Donovan did not argue, did not turn, did not even acknowledge the comment. Instead he crouched slightly near the panel, his fingers moving with a familiarity that did not look like guesswork, that did not look like improvisation, but something older, something practiced long before any of the systems around them had ever existed. And when he pressed again, firmer this time, there was another sound, a faint internal shift, a metallic whisper that seemed to travel through the body of the aircraft like a message passed from one part to another. Airman Reed felt it more than heard it, his eyes narrowing as he glanced back at his tablet, scrolling through the data again, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. But the screen remained unchanged, clean, confident, wrong, and for the first time he hesitated, his thumb hovering over the communication icon as a thought formed that he could not quite justify but could not ignore either. Donovan rose slowly, his movements unhurried despite the ticking clock, and walked toward the cockpit ladder, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with a calm that seemed completely detached from the countdown pressing down on everyone else, and that calm began to spread, unsettling in its quiet certainty, because it did not match the situation. It did not belong in a moment like this. "You are out of time," one of the technicians muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else, as the display on the operations truck flipped to 5 minutes, the red numbers brighter now, harsher, demanding action. Donovan paused at the base of the ladder and placed his hand against the side of the fuselage one more time, a brief contact, almost like a signal, and for a split second his eyes closed, not in hesitation, not in doubt, but in recognition, as if something inside the machine had finally answered back. Far across the tarmac, a black staff vehicle turned sharply onto the access road, tires crunching against gravel as it accelerated toward them, but no one noticed it yet. No one except Reed, whose gaze lifted just long enough to register the movement before snapping back to Donovan, because whatever was happening here felt more immediate, more important. Captain Cole stepped forward, impatience finally breaking through. "That is enough," he said, his voice sharper now, reaching for control that was slipping away, but Donovan was already climbing, one rung at a time, steady, deliberate, and when he reached the cockpit, he did not rush inside, he paused, his hand resting on the frame, his head tilting slightly as if listening again, and then, without a word, he slipped into the seat, the canopy still open, the entire crew watching now, silent, waiting, even if they did not want to admit that they were waiting. Inside the cockpit, the world narrowed to a different kind of silence, one that did not come from absence but from focus, from a space where every sound mattered and every movement had weight, and Donovan settled into the seat like it was something his body still remembered, like time had not taken that part away from him. His hands moved across the controls without hesitation, not rushing, not fumbling, but tracing each switch and dial with a familiarity that did not belong to manuals or recent training. It belonged to memory, the kind that lived deeper than thought. Outside, the crew watched through the open canopy, their earlier confidence now replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, because this no longer felt like a joke, it no longer felt like something that would simply fail and be dismissed. Captain Cole stood rigid near the nose of the aircraft, his eyes fixed on Donovan, waiting for the inevitable misstep, the moment where age or irrelevance would reveal itself, but it did not come, and that absence began to press on him harder than any failure would have. The clock dropped to 4 minutes, the red numbers reflecting off the polished surfaces of the equipment. Each second now stretching longer than it should, each one demanding an outcome. Donovan adjusted a single switch, then paused, his hand hovering just above the panel, and in that pause something shifted behind his eyes, something distant, something pulled from far away. The heat of the tarmac dissolved into something heavier, thicker, the air no longer dry but dense, carrying the faint vibration of engines that had once struggled to stay alive under far worse conditions, and for a brief moment, his fingers remembered working without time, without certainty, guided only by instinct and the need to keep something breathing. The memory did not stay long, it never did, but it left behind a clarity, a precise understanding of what the machine needed and what it was refusing. Outside, Airman Reed swallowed and finally made his choice, stepping back from the group just enough to pull out his phone, his movements careful, discreet, because he did not fully understand what was happening, but he knew it was not normal, and somewhere in the chain of command there was someone who needed to see this before it was too late. The black staff vehicle was closer now, moving fast across the tarmac, its presence cutting through the background noise, but still most eyes remained locked on the cockpit. Donovan's hand lowered again, this time not to a switch, but to a small, nearly forgotten control near the lower panel. Something the newer technicians rarely touched because the system was supposed to handle it automatically, and he held it there for a second longer than expected, as if aligning something unseen, something internal. The aircraft remained silent, unchanged, and a few of the technicians exchanged glances, the old certainty beginning to creep back in, the belief that this would end the way it always should have. With the machine refusing to respond, Captain Cole took a step forward, breath tightening, ready to call it, ready to end this moment before it stretched any further. But then a faint sound emerged, barely there, a soft internal whine that had not existed before, subtle enough to be missed by anyone not listening for it, but undeniable once heard, and Donovan did not react with surprise, did not even look down. He simply adjusted his grip slightly, steady, patient, as if he had been waiting for that exact sound all along. The sound did not rise all at once, it crept forward, a thin, uncertain whine that seemed to test the air before committing to it, and every head on the tarmac turned toward it at the same time, because even the smallest change in that machine carried weight now, carried consequence. Captain Cole froze mid-step, his command caught somewhere between his chest and his throat, because this was not how failure was supposed to look. Failure was supposed to be obvious, loud in its refusal, but this was something else, something quieter and far more unsettling. Donovan remained still in the cockpit, his hand steady on the control, not forcing it, not pushing beyond what the aircraft would give, but holding it at that exact point where resistance and response met, as if he understood the boundary and had no intention of crossing it too soon. The whine grew slightly, not stronger, but clearer, like a signal coming into focus, and the technicians instinctively leaned in, their earlier skepticism dissolving into a focused silence, because now they could hear it too. Now it was real. That should not be happening, one of them whispered, his eyes darting to his tablet again, searching for confirmation that never came, because the system still read perfect, still insisted nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The clock dropped to 3 minutes, the numbers flashing harder now, but no one called it out. No one wanted to break whatever fragile thread had been pulled into place. Donovan adjusted his grip by less than an inch, a movement so small it would have been invisible if not for the immediate response that followed, the whine deepening, settling into a tone that carried weight, that hinted at something waking beneath layers of engineered silence. Far behind the crew, the black staff vehicle came to a sharp stop, the door opening before the engine had fully cut, and Colonel Matthew Briggs stepped out with a speed that ignored protocol, his eyes already locked on the aircraft. Before his boots hit the ground, because he had heard the report, had heard the name, and something about it had pulled him here faster than reason could explain, Airman Reed saw him first, his breath catching as recognition hit, but he said nothing, because the moment unfolding in front of them felt too precise to interrupt. On the tarmac, the air shifted again. As a low vibration began to hum through the structure of the aircraft, subtle but undeniable, a resonance that traveled through metal and into bone, and the crew felt it under their boots, a sensation that bypassed thought and went straight to instinct. Captain Cole's expression changed, the certainty gone now, replaced by something closer to disbelief, because this was no longer a joke, no longer a demonstration. It was becoming something real, something he could not control. Donovan did not look out, did not acknowledge the growing attention, he simply listened, his head tilting slightly as the sound evolved, reading it the way others read instruments, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm, almost conversational. Now she is awake, and as if answering him, the engine responded with a deeper, fuller note, the kind that did not ask for permission, the kind that announced itself, and in that moment, every person on that tarmac understood that the machine had made its choice. The sound did not peak, it settled, deepening into a steady, controlled hum that filled the space around the aircraft without overwhelming it, like a presence that had finally decided to reveal itself after being ignored for too long, and every person on the tarmac felt it differently, some through their ears, others through the subtle vibration under their boots, but none of them could pretend it was not happening anymore. Captain Cole took a slow step back, not out of fear but out of instinct. As if the space around the aircraft now belonged to something else, something he no longer commanded, his earlier authority dissolving in the face of a reality he had not prepared for. Donovan's hands moved again inside the cockpit, not rapidly, not dramatically, but with a precision that matched the rhythm of the engine, each adjustment small, deliberate, aligned with the sound rather than forcing it. And the response was immediate, the hum strengthening, stabilizing, becoming something whole. Instead of fragmented, the technicians stood frozen, their tablets forgotten at their sides, because the data they trusted had failed them, and what replaced it was something they did not know how to measure, something that did not fit into any system they had been trained to rely on. Colonel Briggs closed the distance across the tarmac with long, decisive strides, his gaze locked on the aircraft, but as he drew closer, his pace slowed, not from hesitation, but from recognition, because there was something about the way the machine was coming alive that he had not seen in years, something that did not belong to routine maintenance or scheduled operations. Airman Reed straightened unconsciously as the colonel passed him, the shift in posture automatic, but his eyes never left the cockpit, never left the old man whose presence now seemed to anchor the entire scene. Inside, Donovan leaned slightly forward, listening again, not to the volume of the engine but to its tone, to the subtle imperfections that still lingered beneath the surface, and he made one final adjustment, a movement so precise it looked almost insignificant, yet it carried the weight of everything that had come before it. The engine responded immediately, the sound smoothing out, the rough edges disappearing, replaced by a clean, confident roar that rolled across the tarmac and into the open sky, no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain, but fully awake. A ripple moved through the crew, not noise, not celebration, but a shared realization, a moment where understanding replaced doubt, and even those who had laughed earlier now stood silent, their expressions stripped of arrogance, replaced by something closer to respect. Captain Cole did not speak, did not issue a command, because there was nothing left for him to control. The situation had moved beyond him, beyond his authority, and he knew it. Colonel Briggs stopped just short of the aircraft, his posture straightening as his eyes lifted to the cockpit, and for a brief moment, the two men simply looked at each other, no words, no signals, just recognition passing between them, quiet and absolute. Donovan gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and turned his attention back to the controls, as if the moment did not belong to him, as if it had never been about proving anything at all, only about listening, and answering when the machine finally spoke. The engine held steady, its voice no longer searching but settled into a confident rhythm that filled the air with a presence no one could ignore, and for a moment the entire tarmac seemed to pause around it, as if everything else had become secondary to the fact that it was alive again. Colonel Briggs took another step forward, slower now, his boots striking the concrete with measured intent, his eyes never leaving the cockpit, because what he was seeing was not just a successful start, it was something far rarer, something that could not be taught in any manual or replicated by any system. Captain Cole remained where he stood, his posture rigid but hollowed out, the authority he carried moments ago now replaced by a quiet realization that he had misread the entire situation, that what he had treated as a joke had never been one. The technicians exchanged glances, not speaking, not daring to break the moment, because the machine they had trusted their data to had just responded to something none of their tools had detected, and that truth sat heavily in their silence. Inside the cockpit, Donovan adjusted the throttle slightly, not to increase power but to feel the response, to confirm what he already knew, and the engine answered smoothly, without hesitation, its tone clean and stable, like a voice that had finally found its footing. He listened for another second, longer than necessary for anyone else, but exactly as long as he needed, and then his hands came to rest, still, patient, as if the work had never been about action but about understanding. Below, Airman Reed felt his chest tighten with something he could not name, because this was the first time he had seen experience override everything else, the first time he had watched someone read a machine without looking at a single screen, and it shifted something in him, something that would not go back to the way it was before. The wind moved across the tarmac again, carrying the full sound of the engine outward, rolling across the open space and into the distance, and with it came a sense of finality, not an ending, but a conclusion that needed no explanation. Colonel Briggs stopped directly beneath the cockpit, his posture straightening fully now, shoulders squared, chin lifting slightly as his gaze met Donovan's again. And this time there was no question in it, no need for confirmation, only recognition. The kind that comes from understanding exactly what stands in front of you. For a brief moment, neither man spoke, because words would have reduced what had just happened, would have made it smaller than it was, and neither of them needed that. Captain Cole shifted his weight, his breath shallow, searching for something to say, some way to regain control of the narrative, but nothing came, because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to dismiss. The aircraft continued to run, steady and sure, its presence now a constant, undeniable truth, and every person on that tarmac stood within it, aware in their own way that they had just witnessed something that could not be explained by rank or equipment or procedure, something that existed outside of all of it. Donovan finally removed his hands from the controls and sat back slightly, his expression unchanged, calm, almost distant, as if the moment did not belong to him, as if it had simply passed through him on its way to becoming something real. And below, the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with a respect that no one had spoken but everyone understood. The sound of the engine no longer demanded attention, it commanded it, rolling across the tarmac in a steady, controlled force that left no room for doubt, and yet no one moved, because the moment had shifted from action to recognition, from uncertainty to something far more absolute. Colonel Briggs stood beneath the cockpit, his presence now as still as the aircraft was alive, his eyes fixed upward, taking in not just the machine, but the man seated within it, and there was a weight to that gaze, a history behind it, something that connected this moment to others long before it. Captain Cole finally exhaled, a slow release of tension he had been holding without realizing it, his shoulders dropping slightly as the reality settled in, because this was no longer about whether the aircraft could start, it was about who had made it happen, and what that meant for everything he thought he understood. The technicians remained silent, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet recalibration, each of them replaying the last few minutes in their minds, searching for a step they had missed, a signal they had ignored. But the truth was harder than that, it was not about missing something, it was about not knowing it existed at all. Inside the cockpit, Donovan reached forward and made one final adjustment, not to correct anything, but to confirm stability, his movements as measured as before. As if nothing had changed, as if the outcome had always been expected. The engine responded with a smooth, unwavering tone, its rhythm now consistent, reliable, alive in a way that left no question. Donovan then leaned back slightly and looked down toward the colonel, his expression unchanged, calm, almost detached, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them that did not need words, a mutual understanding built on experience rather than explanation. Colonel Briggs straightened fully, his posture sharpening into something unmistakable, something that every person on that tarmac recognized instantly, and without hesitation, without announcement. He raised his hand in a crisp, deliberate salute. The gesture cut through the moment with a clarity that no sound could match, and for a fraction of a second, no one reacted, because it did not make sense to them, not in the structure they understood, not in the hierarchy they believed in, and yet there it was, undeniable. Airman Reed felt it first, the shift, the realization, and his spine straightened instinctively, his hand rising almost before he was aware of it, followed by another, and then another, until the entire line of technicians stood at attention, their earlier laughter replaced by silence, their posture reflecting a respect they had not known they were about to give. Captain Cole hesitated, just for a moment, the weight of his earlier words pressing against him, but even he could not ignore what was in front of him, and slowly, deliberately, he brought his hand up as well. The engine continued to run, steady and strong, but it was no longer the center of the moment. It had become the backdrop, the proof, while the focus shifted entirely to the quiet figure in the cockpit, who did not return the salute immediately, who did not acknowledge it in the way expected, but simply sat there, composed, as if the recognition belonged not to him, but to something much older, something that had been waiting far longer than any of them realized. Donovan did not move immediately, and that stillness carried more weight than any gesture, because it held the entire moment in place, stretching it just long enough for everyone on the tarmac to fully understand what had happened and what it meant. The engine continued its steady, controlled roar, no longer the focus but the foundation, a constant reminder that what they were witnessing was real, undeniable, and already beyond reversal. Colonel Briggs held his salute, unwavering, not out of formality but out of certainty, because recognition, when it is true, does not hesitate. Inside the cockpit, Donovan finally shifted, not with urgency, not with pride, but with the same quiet control that had guided every movement before, and he raised his hand in return, the motion precise, measured, and without display, as if it were simply the correct response to something that had already been decided long ago. The exchange was brief, but it settled the moment completely, turning silence into something solid, something shared. Below, the line of personnel remained at attention, their posture unchanged, their expressions no longer questioning, because whatever doubt had existed before had been replaced by a clarity that did not require explanation. Captain Cole lowered his hand last, slower than the others, his gaze fixed on the cockpit, not with resentment, not even with embarrassment, but with something closer to realization, the kind that comes when a boundary you believed in quietly disappears. He took a step back, not retreating, but making space, acknowledging without words that the moment no longer belonged to him. Airman Reed exhaled softly, the tension leaving his shoulders, but something else remained, something new, something that would stay with him long after this day, because he had seen the difference between knowing and understanding, and it was not something he would forget. Donovan's hand returned to the controls one last time, not to change anything, but to secure the state he had created, to leave the machine exactly as it needed to be, and then he powered it down with the same care he had used to bring it to life, the engine's roar fading gradually, not abruptly, settling back into silence as if it had simply completed a conversation. The absence of sound did not empty the space, it filled it, because now the silence carried meaning, carried memory. Donovan rose from the seat and climbed down the ladder with unhurried steps, his boots meeting the tarmac with a soft, final certainty, and when he reached the ground, he did not look around for approval, did not wait for acknowledgment, he simply stepped aside, returning to the same quiet place he had stood before. Colonel Briggs lowered his hand and stepped forward, stopping just short of him, his posture still firm, his voice low but clear when it finally came. "Good to see you again, sir," and Donovan gave a small nod, nothing more, because nothing more was needed. The crew remained silent, watching, understanding that whatever history existed between those two men was deeper than anything they had just witnessed, and yet somehow connected to it entirely. The wind moved across the tarmac once more, carrying away the last traces of heat and sound, leaving behind only the memory of what had happened and the weight of what it meant, and in that quiet, unspoken space, one truth settled over all of them, steady and certain, that Respect is not given by rank or demanded by voice, it is earned in moments like this, and remembered long after the noise is gone.